Good morning on the 25th of February 2022, and it's a big day here, not in very positive terms, not horrible either. It means today is the first real hay feeding day. Out of grass, or as good as, in this first grazing area, about which I explain more in previous videos how it works. But on the 25th of February, the grass is done. So I've gathered some hay from the hay barn, which all comes from our own land and from a little bit of surrounding land from neighbors. So it's very local, and I'm just going to give that to them now.
So by the way, transporting the hay in a tarp is, I find, the easiest way to do it. You just put the amount of hay that you want on the tarp, fold it, pick up the 4 points. You can carry it a bit like a rucksack or something like that, and it's very easy that way. So I pick a spot. I don't just dump it anywhere. I pick a spot where there may not be so much manure visible yet. Maybe because there wasn't that much food to eat, they didn't spend that much time there. And so by spreading the hay there, because it will keep them busy for at least half an hour eating that, and they'll come back several times during the day to look for the last bits. They will also walk around, and certainly while now the ice is retreating, it's melting and it's then exposing grass that they haven't had a chance to eat yet. So they're not 100% on hay at this time. I don't dare to estimate, but sometimes they're surprisingly full, especially on a warmer day when the ice retreated quite a lot. But I really pick my spot so that the manure load is not especially high in one spot, but very low in another. I want it to be sort of equally high, so that also the spots where there wasn't much to eat, because maybe not much grew there, gets some manure, and then the soil life there will be helped, and that then will help more grass grow. Also, there is a lot of seed in the hay, so especially in the poorer areas, feeding hay there may actually replenish the seed bank and help new plants get settled there and start growing. So because I have a lot of hay available for free, it can actually be really good to feed it to them.
So that's them with their first kind of necessary hay feeding. I have to explain, I fed hay once so far, and that was really only because I didn't manage to move them that day. I found they were unexpectedly early with being done with one of the paddocks. Didn't have much food left. I estimated that there should be enough for at least another day. There wasn't really. But I had to go away that day, so I didn't have time to move, and then I gave them hay. Had I not gone away that day, it would simply have been a matter of moving them on a bit earlier, and then they would have been fine again with a whole new paddock with grass still there. Now I'm out of paddocks in this grazing system. There is another one past this fence here. You see the shelter that I'm working on. That is not finished yet. I had planned it to be finished already. Still have a bit of fencing work to do as well. But the weather has been absolutely ridiculous here the past few months. I would say it's been a cold autumn, relatively, and a cold early winter perhaps as well, with a few times we've had -20 or thereabouts Celsius. But January and February have been extremely warm, so it's yeah, for those who've seen previous videos, I keep banging on about this, but being able to see grass now in just a tiny bit of snow is absolutely, that's not to be expected here, although it has happened more often the last 5 years or so. Anyway, yeah, you might expect that it warming up, it makes it easier to graze for the sheep and for me to manage it. It really isn't. And again, I have talked about that in previous videos, but you see here and all over here where the snow has partially melted and then refroze, and that quite a few times. And instead of having nice soft fluffy snow through which the sheep can dig to find the grass that is preserved underneath, they cannot. A solid layer of ice, these soft sheep hooves can really not manage to break through that. Soft snow, absolutely no problem. They can dig like sheep. They're really good at it. They're kind of built for it, but ice they won't get through, of course. And that reflects a bit in the numbers that I can give you, because yeah, I can really say they're practically, there is still more grass that they can eat, but by now it just takes too much time to find it. There's too little and it's too far between bites, so they will not be able to fill their bellies properly anymore, given the day length, and also it takes too much energy to find it, probably. So they have to spend more energy finding that bite than eating that bite will provide them. And therefore, hay time. But it's time to make up the balance now that this whole grazing area, this almost 2 hectare area, is finished. And I am keeping track of what happened so far on a Holistically Planned Grazing chart, which I can show you, although it won't make too much sense if you haven't seen one before. In pencil, you see what I estimated before the grazing in this area this winter started, what I estimated, how long they could stay in each paddock, how much food there would be, and then in black pen you see my daily record keeping of what actually happened. This grazing chart is extremely valuable. The planning already forces you to think of what is likely in store, and then as you keep your daily record, you can very easily, very quickly see when you start to deviate and in which direction are you having more food than you expected or less, and does that change throughout the winter. And yes, there have been very big changes. They are now in the second quarter of this grazing system, which I kept for last. They started in the first quarter of the grazing system, running from the shelter there to the perimeter fence here, from the shelter to the perimeter fence over there. Hard to see, but that quarter, I didn't so much. I kept record of both actual days and of sheep days. Sheep days makes a bit more sense. So imagine you would have 10 sheep in a certain area on one day, and by that time they would be done grazing. It would all be gone. 10 sheep one day is 10 sheep days. So that area will have fed 10 sheep for one day. Or then you can extrapolate, that same area could feed 1 sheep for 10 days, right? That quarter was the first one we grazed starting 12th of November, and it was good for 352 sheep days. I knew that that was a good quarter. It was the first one grazed during spring last year, so it had a lot of time to recover, and it did recover quite well. But because it had so much time to recover, a lot of the plants probably, well, most, I would guess, maybe all, actually managed to get to the seeding stage to drop the seeds, and then the quality of the above ground green starts to deteriorate. The annual plants will start dying because they've done their job, their life is over. It's now waiting for the next generation this spring to start growing. And the perennial plants will start putting more energy in root growth than in more above ground green growth. The green they will maintain as much as they can because it is the green parts which photosynthesize and which then provide the energy and the material for the roots to grow and to store energy in. But all the same, there is not going to be an awful lot of new green growth coming anymore, and most of it will start to go down a bit. So by the time winter hit, by the time the snow came, then what was preserved underneath the snow had gone past its prime. Q2, where they are in now, and that runs from the shelter again to the perimeter fence here, and from the shelter to, it's hard for me to see on the screen now, that white fence. So this whole area, in size it's comparable to Q1. It will be a bit different, but I've never bothered to really look into the actual numbers. But that was only good for 170 sheep days. So that is less than half of Q1. And actually I expected it to be somewhat better, or at least as good. Why? Because they had gone through Q2 during the growing season a bit later. Back then Q1 came first, and then they went into 2. So Q2 also had a lot of time to recover, but actually was greener by the time that the snow came. So it hadn't progressed so far past the seeding stage yet, and therefore I estimated there to be more nutrition in this paddock than in Q1. And actually by the time the snow came, that might have been true. Of course, when they went into Q1 this winter, or autumn, the 12th of November, the plants had not been touched by frost, and certainly not by repeated thawing and refreezing as this quarter has over the last 2 months, because that happened quite a lot, these partial thaws and refreezes. So Q1 was, as far as you can have a prime feed by the start of the winter grazing, was really good. Even though some of that green had started to deteriorate simply because it had gone past seeding, it had not deteriorated much or hardly at all because of the winter situation. When the snow hit, the temperatures were actually quite consistently low as far as I can remember now. So then that green would have been preserved very well. Whereas this quarter, and that's the same goes in varying degrees for the other 2 quarters behind the shelter there, this quarter really had to go through all of those thaws and refreezes. And every time that happens, especially both the thaw and the refreeze cause a lot of deterioration of the green. Perhaps it was already mostly dead before the snow came, but it was still green, and then the snow preserved it. And then as the temperatures rise, would be a bit like having salad in the freezer, and then you thaw it out, and then it's really not all that tasty anymore. Well, grass doesn't react as quickly as lettuce does and some other vegetables, but it does really start to deteriorate after thawing. And then refreezing, so that now slightly mushy green that has thawed will freeze again, damaging yet more cells, and that time and time again. So I think nutrition has gone down a lot even if perhaps it was on par with Q1 when the winter started. That is interesting. I will have to think long and hard about the planning for next winter. There's a lot of time to do that still, fortunately, about how all that goes. But that is way too far going for this video here. But I'll give you a few more details of the balance of this grazing area. So I said Q1 was 352 grazing days, or sheep days rather, sorry, and Q2, where they are now, 170. Q4 and Q3 were in between those numbers. Q4 was 198 and Q3 275. Even though, hello Agnar, even though they're all next to each other, the circumstances are quite different. So Q1 and Q2 are quite sunny. They get most of the sun, especially afternoon and early morning already too, actually. And then Q3 and 4 behind the shelter, they get a lot less, especially in the morning, because that is where the sun rises, that's east. So those trees keep those quarters in shadow. Sun is a lot higher in the horizon, on the horizon, in the sky already this time of year compared to December, and so it's a bit different now. But taking all that together comes to 995 sheep days. The number of sheep varied a tiny little bit over that time. Agnar here only arrived in November, later in November, and that was after one of my own ram lambs was sold. So that was a bit of change. And then also a bit of a sad story. One of the female lambs I had to slaughter. That was absolutely not planned, but she proved to be a bit too rebellious for this grazing management. She managed to find out how to squeeze through underneath these net fences that you see here, especially when there was a lot of snow and ice. Then those fences were a bit higher. The bottom was off the ground a little bit, and she found out how to push her nose underneath and then very quickly run under, and then her thick wool protected her from the shock. And I tried many things to stop her doing that, like weighing down the nets with large pieces of wood, but she had absolutely no trouble thwarting all my efforts and found ways to get underneath again to the following paddock where the grass was still higher. And yeah, then it became a choice between letting her do what she did, with the risk of other sheep learning how to do it as well, and then my whole grazing management, the holistically planned grazing management, going out the window. Or I could just have removed all the internal fencing so that none of them would learn how to escape. But then, yeah, few sheep in a large area make inefficient use of the grass that is there. The last bits will then be hard to find, and then well, that's quite a talk in its own right, so I won't go too deep into that. But unfortunately, I had to decide, I think, that if I wanted to maintain the best possible conditions for the animals that remained, and certainly also for the grass and the land itself, that I had to keep going with the fencing, the mobile fencing system as it is, again, as explained in other videos. And so her being too rebellious, not staying with the flock, I decided to be the predator that would, in wild circumstances, have also taken the loner who goes away too far from the flock, and I slaughtered her. Yep, unplanned, but as it happened, it was the cleanest kill I think I've ever done of all the chickens and ducks and rabbits that I've done. So as far as that goes, it was okay. These sheep are meant to be for meat production eventually. It just happened sooner than I thought it would, and she was not on the list. None of them at the moment is to be slaughtered, but sometimes I think you have little choice. Anyway, 995 days. So what does that mean? That's getting close to 3.5, 4 months in 2 hectares, slightly under 2 hectares for between 10 and 11 sheep. My estimate was roughly that, so that's pretty good. But as I started early in the winter, certainly there in Q1, where they managed to stay well fed much longer than I thought. I was actually hoping that they could stay longer. But all in all, not a really bad situation. And again, as I often do, I compare to all the other people keeping grazing animals in the area around me. There are unfortunately not very many, but the ones that I know of and that I keep a bit of an eye on, those animals have been on hay since November, sometimes even a bit earlier, October, sometimes even September, because these animals were kept in just one grazing area, and come September they had eaten all the grass, and then there is not much regrowth anymore. September it really starts to slow down. October it pretty much stops, and then by the time the snow comes there really isn't anything left, and then hay has to be fed every day. I managed to postpone that until now. Had I been able to finish the next growing or grazing area with that new shelter I'm building and some fencing work I still have to do, had I finished that in time, I would have moved them there today, and then I could have postponed feeding hay yet another, and this is hard to say because of the snow cover there. I can't really at this time estimate how much food there is, but that should have lasted at least another 2 weeks, so it should have taken me and these ladies and one gentleman into March, mid-March, if lucky. So it really is a matter of me finishing that other grazing area, which should take another few days at most. I also have to do my tax declaration, so that is another bit of a spoke in the wheel, but a few more days and then the hay feeding will stop again. They will move to that grazing area. Should be okay for another 2, maybe 3 weeks on the grass that is there. By that time, I really can't predict what the weather situation will be like. Mid-March is very early in this area to expect any growth happening already, or the ground to be so soft already that I can use those net fences on their own without support of wooden posts like here, so that I can move them outside of the permanent fences, because I still do have another 1.5 hectares which are not permanently fenced, but I can only have them in there if I can use those net fences on their own, if I can poke those metal spikes underneath. Again, hard to see, I think there's one here. The metal spikes at the bottom, if I can't push them into the ground and pull them out again when I'm done, then I can't go outside the perimeter fences. So yeah, anything can happen mid-March. We'll see about that. But all in all, I am really not unhappy with how it has gone this winter. It may be interesting to think about. Well, I have the luxury that I have hay. I have my own hay, which should last for... I'm also feeding the rabbits with that, and they eat quite a lot as well. Not as much as the sheep, but more than you would think. I may have enough hay of my own for another 2 weeks. Once that is gone, I have the luxury of having a neighbor, maybe a kilometer, 1.5 kilometers away, who sold his cows last year, and still had a lot of hay left, even though it's a bit older already. I think that might be 2 years old by now, so not as good as this, which I and volunteers scythed ourselves last year. But it will still feed them for that last bit of winter quite well. So what would happen if I would not have hay? You know, this thing about self-sufficiency. If you're doing it on your own or just with a family, like I live with my mother together, and for roughly half the year we have volunteers usually, and there's one coming next month. But you need only a very, very few small things going wrong to not be able to, for example, make hay in summer. And yeah, many things can go wrong. You know, if you're just a few people and you have a little accident, your back gives out, break a finger or a leg, you can do an awful lot less. And then it is very easy to imagine that there will not be hay next winter. It might just happen. And we've seen how extremely changeable things are with the COVID crisis, which I think was a plandemic, absolutely. Now that has simmered out, don't hear much about it because the Ukraine has taken over as the next big crisis, which we all have to be very worried about and gobble up the propaganda from the Western propaganda machine. Volatile times, you really don't know what is going to happen, and changes can happen extremely quickly and can be very dramatic, as we have seen the last 2 years. All to say that now that I have my fencing system set up and I know that it works, and I know from this winter that even with absolutely horrific, very, very suboptimal growing weather conditions which really badly affect the nutrition available on the land, I can still graze my animals until kind of mid-March, especially if that other grazing area is finished, of course. That is very valuable to know, and that is why I was so anxious to try and postpone the feeding of hay until the very last moment, so that I know how long I can feed them on the grass that is there. So this allows me then to calculate how many sheep I can have here in the grazing areas that I do have, and then sort of worst case scenario weather-wise. So that means that between 10 and 11 sheep is just a bit too much for the worst case weather scenario. If the weather would be a lot better, I think this number would be fine. But should I find myself in the situation that there is no hay, the zombie apocalypse comes, and I manage to survive somehow, then yep, I can calculate how many sheep I can get through winter without hay, or with the amount of hay that I do have. And then early on I will be able to see if I have to get rid of a few, put them in the freezer, which of course won't work, but then hopefully there will be still enough winter that the outside temperature will be good enough for keeping the meat. Anyway, I know now that even if there is no hay, and even if the weather is horrible, I can keep sheep here. The worst, at the very worst, I know that I should be able to keep 6 or 7 through winter easily. That is a big thing. That really is valuable knowledge. And it is really due to this kind of grazing, the holistically planned grazing, that it is possible. Because again, those people who have had to start feeding their animals hay in September, October, November already, and will be feeding them hay well into probably April, May, they will not be able to get their sheep through winter if there is no hay. If the whole infrastructure for making hay, because most of them use big machines rather than the scythe that I use, they will be helpless. They will not get their animals through winter, and in spring they will have no animals anymore, whereas I can breed them again in spring, get lambs, take care of the next generation. So like I tend to say towards the end of the video, holistically planned grazing, it's absolutely brilliant, and more people should look into it. It is a lot of work to get the fencing system up, to plan it, to design it, to foolproof it, because almost certainly, especially if you do it for the first time like I did, your fence will not be perfect and there will be escapes and you will have to adjust and so on and so forth. But once it's up and running, it isn't much work anymore, and it is good for the land, it's good for the animals, it's good for you. Look into it. Thanks for listening.